High above the skies of France on August 18, 1944, the most unbelievable and physics-defying moment in aviation history was unfolding. Inside the cockpit of a U.S. Army Air Force's P-51 Mustang, a space so claustrophobic that a single pilot could barely turn his shoulders, two fully grown men were violently crammed together. One man was literally straddling the other's lap, their bodies pressed so tightly that their helmets were mere fractions of an inch from shattering the canopy glass that refused to close completely. Below them, plumes of thick black smoke billowed from the burning wreckage of another fighter plane. Meanwhile, heavily armed Nazi troops sprinted across the mud, firing their weapons in a desperate bid to rip the American aircraft to shreds. This is not some exaggerated, adrenaline-fueled Hollywood blockbuster sequence. This is the absolute, unvarnished truth of a life-or-death escape that took place in a French wheat field. A severely overweight, single-seat fighter plane was tearing down a bumpy, muddy, makeshift runway. Its landing gear groaned in agony, the mighty engine screamed on the very edge of catastrophic failure, and its wings were about to scrape the tops of the tree line. Could they possibly cheat death? What kind of heart-stopping, suicidal rescue mission was this? Today, we are going to part the heavy smoke of World War to unrelive a deeply buried, blood-forged legend of brotherhood. The origins of this incredible saga begin with a larger-than-life figure, Major Bert Marshall, the commanding officer of the 354th Fighter Squadron. He was part of the legendary 8th Air Force. Marshall was a man who seemed born with a blinding aura of success. Long before he ever donned a military uniform, he was a three-time All-State quarterback in Texas high school football. He was also an All-American star at Vanderbilt University. He was a man entirely accustomed to leading the charge while the world watched. When he brought that same ferocious, front-line leadership to the brutal theater of the Second World War, nothing changed. Arriving at his squadron in early June 1940 for with a mere 3 hours of flight time in the P-51, he immediately plunged into the monumental chaos of the Normandy invasion. Within 2 short months, he had blasted 5 enemy aircraft out of the sky. By doing this, he earned the elite title of Fighter Ace. His relentless aggression, masterful piloting skills, and rocker-ism were evident. This undeniable charisma made him an irreplaceable idol to the young, green aviators under his command. Among that flock of admirers was a 21-year-old lieutenant named Royce Priest. The young pilot's reverence for his commanding officer bordered on absolute worship. Priest had spent countless hours studying Marshall's tactical maneuvers, meticulously mimicking his every move in the air. He was dreaming of the day he could dominate the European skies with the same effortless lethality. Yet, on this fateful day of August 18th, Priest was about to witness the unthinkable, the sudden, violent downfall of his hero. The squadron was operating near St. Etienne, executing highly dangerous low-altitude strafing runs. The German forces in the area had elevated the art of camouflage to a deadly science. They had concealed lethal 20mm and 40mm anti-aircraft flak batteries inside seemingly innocent haystacks. These were also hidden in farm buildings and even inside train cars distinctly marked with the Red Cross symbol. As Major Marshall led his 4-ship formation into the zone, completely unaware of the trap, the sides of those disguised train cars suddenly dropped open. A devastating wall of flak erupted into the sky, sweeping toward the American fighters like the Sith of the Grim Reaper. The ambush was masterfully orchestrated, and the distance was point blank. Major Marshall's Mustang took a catastrophic, direct hit right beneath the exhaust stacks of its pride and joy, the legendary Merlin engine. A second explosive shell ruthlessly punctured the radiator intake. Viscous coolant fluid instantly blew out. It was vaporizing into a brilliant white mist that trailed behind the doomed aircraft. Circling helplessly in the skies above, young Lieutenant Priest watched in pure horror. He saw his commander's plane trailing thick, greasy black smoke, the engine gasping its final, violent breaths. Marshall had no choice but to bring the dying bird down, belly landing in a golden wheat field a terrifying 20 miles behind heavily fortified German lines. The massive, multi-ton fighter slammed into the soft earth, bouncing violently twice before tearing through the tall wheat stalks. It eventually ground to a brutal halt just 300 yards from a dense woodline. Priest immediately threw his Mustang into a tight orbit at 1,500 feet. By some miracle, he saw Marshall emerge from the tree line, his face blackened with soot, waving his arms furiously to signal he was alive. But the relief was entirely fleeting, instantly replaced by a crushing sense of doom. Less than half a mile away, a military transport truck packed with 20 to 30 heavily armed German infantrymen was tearing down a dirt road, heading straight for the crash site. The soldiers vaulted out of the back of the transport truck, instantly fanning out into a disciplined combat formation. They were moving steadily toward Marshall like a pack of starving wolves catching the scent of fresh blood in the wind. The absolute nightmare was compounding by the second. A second truck was rapidly approaching from the north side. Additionally, a motorcycle with a sidecar was barreling down a farm lane to the south. The net was closing fast. Major Marshall was completely surrounded by the advancing enemy forces in the middle of the golden French wheat field. If you strictly followed the unbending protocols of the United States Army Air Forces in this particular situation, a wingman's only duty when a fellow pilot went down behind enemy lines was to radio the exact location coordinates. They were officially supposed to call for search and rescue, log the incident, and fly straight back to the base. Attempting a ground landing, that was universally condemned as an absolute, suicidal violation of military orders. The P-51 Mustang was a precision-engineered, single-seat killing machine built exclusively for the high skies. It had zero provisions for any passengers, and it certainly was never designed to land in the soft rural farm fields. It was absolutely not meant to touch down in the deeply rutted agricultural fields found throughout rural France. Any obstacle taller than 18 inches, hidden in that tall wheat, could effortlessly rip the belly scoop clean off. This impact would immediately destroy the engine and leave the entire aircraft completely stranded in enemy territory. The narrow, delicate landing gear struts were engineered exclusively for paved, hardened concrete military runways. A single hidden ditch or a stray rock in a rural farmer's field would instantly flip the high-speed fighter aircraft. This failure would send the entire machine tumbling onto its back in a sudden, completely fatal explosion of fire. Major Marshall, a seasoned combat veteran and commanding officer, understood these lethal variables better than anyone. He keyed his walkie-talkie and screamed into the radio, invoking his supreme military authority on the battlefield. He ordered Priest to abort any heroic rescue thoughts and return to England immediately without looking back once. Marshall was fully prepared to accept his grim and inevitable fate in a Nazi prisoner of war camp right then and there. He absolutely refused to let a brilliant young aviator throw his entire life away in a completely doomed rescue attempt. But up in the narrow cockpit, hearing the definitive order to leave his beloved commander behind in the hostile field, 21-year-old Royce Priest's hand completely froze over the metal switch of the aircraft communication radio. He quickly glanced down at his instrument fuel gauges. He looked out the canopy at the tiny figure of his trapped hero. His esteemed commanding officer was about to be completely swallowed by the rapidly advancing enemy ground troops. In that exact split-second, Priest made the most insubordinate and legally catastrophic choice of his entire life. It was easily the most undeniably breathtaking and dangerous decision of his entire military career as an aviator. He decided not to answer the radio order. Instead, he slammed the control stick forward and dropped his aircraft flaps. He pushed them to a steep 40 degrees, rapidly slashing his airspeed to a highly perilous 90 miles per hour. He plummeted from the sky like a diving falcon, aiming his aircraft straight down into the golden wheat field below. He aggressively targeted the longest patch of wheat he could spot, preparing for an incredibly dangerous landing maneuver. The wheels of Priest's Mustang slammed violently into the unforgiving and deeply rutted French agricultural soil below. The massive metal airframe convulsed violently over the rough terrain, shrieking loudly with a truly horrific sound. It was the terrifying noise of heavy metal grinding ruthlessly against the hardened, unforgiving European terrain. Priest stood heavily on the aircraft brakes, the tires skidding and tearing through the thick mud of the farm field. The plane finally, miraculously, lurched to a sudden halt just a short distance from the commander's smoking wreck. Without wasting a singular heartbeat, Priest skillfully manipulated the throttle and rudder with expert pilot precision. He violently whipped the aircraft completely around until its nose was pointed directly at the advancing enemy troop wave. The front of his powerful fighter plane was now aiming straight toward the incoming line of hostile German infantrymen. In an absolute instant, the graceful and fast fighter plane was transformed into a devastating stationary ground turret. The .650 caliber heavy machine guns mounted securely in the wings of the Mustang erupted in an earth-shaking roar, spitting out a truly horrifying 80 for massive armor-piercing rounds every single second of the brutal engagement. Priest successfully laid down an impenetrable wall of lead that instantly shredded the advancing German troop assault. Brightly lit tracer rounds danced wildly and dangerously through the tall stalks of the golden French wheat field. The lead enemy transport truck was violently blown apart, exploding into bright flames and careening into a ditch. Up above in the sky, the remaining two Mustang fighter planes in the flight formation did not just sit and watch the event. They howled down rapidly from the thick clouds like avenging angels, aggressively strafing the secondary enemy convoy. They successfully blasted the military motorcycle and its riders directly into the thick brush on the side of the road. Seizing this impossibly brief window of total pursuivus fire against the heavily armed advancing enemy infantry forces, Major Marshall quickly channeled every single ounce of his old college quarterback sprinting speed on the battlefield. He was rapidly tearing across the muddy field, heading straight toward the idling engine of Priest's waiting aircraft. Precious time was rapidly evaporating, and every single fraction of a second dictated whether they would live or die. Priest violently ripped open his glass canopy and frantically unbuckled his heavy and restrictive parachute harness. He grabbed his bulky life-saving dinghy and immediately hurled them both out of the narrow cockpit and into the dirt. Discarding this vital flight equipment in the middle of a combat zone was an absolutely terrifying personal sacrifice. Without a parachute, he was fully committing to ride the plane directly into the ground if the massive engine failed. Without the life raft, a forced ditching in the freezing English Channel meant certain and agonizing death by drowning. However, his own personal survival and well-being in this horrific war were simply no longer the main priority for him. He absolutely needed to clear out every single cubic inch of space inside the tiny cockpit for his fleeing commander. Marshall quickly hauled his exhausted body up onto the metal wing of the airplane, gasping for fresh air. He contorted his body to force himself into a space barely 38 inches wide and less than 42 inches tall. The overall visual scene of this rescue attempt was completely absurd, yet it was also undeniably and deeply heroic. Marshall, standing 5'11" and weighing a solid 170 pounds, was shrink-wrapped against Priest. Due to the extreme lack of space, the younger fighter pilot was physically forced to straddle both of Marshall's legs. The vital metal flight control stick was currently jammed extremely precariously right between young Priest's knees. The heavy shoulders of the two adult men were forcefully and painfully crushed tightly against one another in the seat. Furthermore, the top of Marshall's leather flight helmet was constantly scraping hard against the glass roof of the canopy. Reaching up slowly with trembling and physically exhausted arms, Priest managed to haul the heavy glass canopy tightly shut. The metal locking mechanism clicked securely into place at a distance of less than a single inch from his own fragile skull. The deeply microscopic internal environment was instantly suffocating, relentlessly baking in the brutal heat of the summer. It was heavily choking both of them with the toxic raw engine exhaust fumes and the extremely foul stench of nervous sweat. The crucial and vital flight instruments on the dashboard were now completely obscured from view by young Priest's knees. This dangerous situation forced him to physically peek around his own limbs just to read the critical life or death dials. There was absolutely no spare time left to wait safely on the ground for the operating temperatures of the engine. The surviving German soldiers were recovering from the shock of the violent strafing run, raising their weapons and firing. The truly terrifying thud of heavy bullets striking the metal skin of the Mustang loudly echoed through the tight cockpit. Gritting his teeth in pure determination, Priest aggressively pushed the main engine throttle handle flush to the firewall. The mighty Merlin engine screamed loudly, violently unleashing all 1,200 horsepower in an ear-shattering roar. This immense mechanical display of pure force and noise seemed to challenge the very fundamental concept of destiny and fate. The brutally overweight fighters struggled to move forward. The tires spun uselessly in the thick mud of the field. Meanwhile, the tall Golden Wheat aggressively battered the metal underside of the airplane wings without any mercy. The forward acceleration of the heavy aircraft was agonizingly slow. The speed indicator reached 60 miles per hour. Then it slowly climbed to 70 and 80 miles per hour. The darkened, impenetrable wall of the forest at the edge. This solid wall of trees was rushing straight toward their glass windshield at a truly terrifying and lethal velocity. A standard military P-51 Mustang required at least 100 miles per hour to merely lift off the solid ground. However, Priest was doing the terrifying mathematical calculations in his head while staring at the approaching trees. With Commander Marshall's heavy dead weight dragging them down, he knew they would not fly under 115 knots. In the final, heart-stopping fraction of a second, the windshield was completely filled by the rough bark and leaves. Seeing the encroaching trees directly ahead, Priest rapidly hauled back on the flight control stick with all his might. By sheer, unadulterated human willpower, the nose of the heavy Mustang fighter clawed its way forcefully into the sky. The metallic belly of the aircraft shaved the tops of the tree branches, leaving deep, visible scratches along the skin. The aircraft's stall warning horn shrieked a bloody murder in their ears, alerting them to the extreme lack of airspeed. The entire plane shuddered violently from side to side, as if the air itself was aggressively rejecting their presence. Yet, against every single law of aerodynamics and military common sense, the two desperate men were finally airborne. The fully grown men, mangled tightly together in a cockpit built for only one, had blasted out of a German kill zone. They had successfully escaped the immediate danger, but the true nightmare of their long journey was only just beginning. Closely escorted by their loyal wingmen, they slowly clawed their way up to a cruising altitude of 8,000 feet. They pointed the nose of the damaged aircraft toward England. However, the crisis in the engine bay was escalating fast. During the desperate mud takeoff, the massive air scoop had inhaled huge clumps of dirt and thick agricultural wheat stalks. This foreign debris was severely choking the vital and necessary airflow to the complex radiators of the fighter plane. The engine temperature needle on the dashboard was creeping steadily and relentlessly toward the catastrophic red line. The legendary Merlin engine was now a raging internal furnace, threatening to seize up and tear itself apart at any moment. Young Lieutenant Priest was entirely trapped in a lethal dilemma high above the war-worn landscape of the European continent. He could push the speed to escape the flak-filled skies of occupied France, or throttle back to lower the engine heat. Throttling back would successfully prevent the overheating engine from melting down into a block of completely useless slag. He smartly chose the latter option, pulling back the engine power to a much slower and far more conservative cruise speed. But this meant extending their dangerous exposure over 180 miles of hostile anti-aircraft territory. For 47 agonizing minutes, they limped slowly across the European continent inside the severely crippled airplane. They flew over enemy lines until the cold, unwelcoming gray waters of the English Channel finally appeared below them. Inside the cramped cockpit, the physical conditions for the two exhausted pilots were completely indistinguishable from hell. The bright August sun beat down heavily through the unshaded plexiglass canopy, turning the small space into an oven. Both men were completely drenched in sweat, with their heavy military flight suits clinging uncomfortably to their skin. Marshall's legs, pinned tightly beneath Priest's entire body weight, had long since lost all of their normal blood circulation. They were completely numb, dead weights that he could not twitch or move even if his very survival depended upon doing so. The 21-mile crossing of the Channel, normally a brief, throttle-wide sprint, stretched into an absolute eternity. Without the parachute and without the life raft, a failure of the overheating engine right now meant a certain tragic end. They would immediately plunge deep into the freezing ocean depths and simply vanish forever beneath the unforgiving waves. Finally, the iconic, chalk-white cliffs of the English coast pierced through the dense ocean haze in the far distance. The two men, strung tighter than piano wire, let out a massive breath they felt they had been holding for an entire hour. Approaching the STE Apelmoord airbase in Cambridgeshire, Priest had to fly a dangerously fast landing pattern. Fearing the heavily burdened aircraft would drop like a stone if he slowed down, he brought the Mustang in hot. He was flying at a dangerous speed of 140 miles per hour as the heavy landing gear slammed down. The wheels hit the unforgiving concrete of the military runway, the rubber tires smoking in protest against friction. The plane rolled for what felt like miles before finally, blessedly, bleeding off the last of its forward speed. Ground crews and medical medics rushed the aircraft with stretchers, expecting to pull a bleeding pilot out. They were greeted by a sight that would be burned into the mythology of the military airbase forever. The canopy slid back, and two grown men, looking utterly absurd and completely exhausted, began to move. They began the clumsy, painful process of untangling themselves from the tiny confines of the fighter cockpit. Major Marshall, his legs completely paralyzed from the agonizing flight, had to be physically dragged out. He was carefully placed onto a medical stretcher by the shocked ground crew members on the runway tarmac. Priest, shaking uncontrollably from the massive adrenaline crash, could barely stand on his own 2 feet. The tale of this impossible rescue spread like wildfire, becoming an instant legend among the 8th Air Force. But up in the lofty offices of High Command, it created an absolute bureaucratic nightmare for the military leaders. Lieutenant Priest had blatantly, unrepeatedly, ignored a direct, lawful order from his commanding officer. It risked a highly expensive, vital piece of military machinery and recklessly endangered his own life. General James Doolittle, the legendary commander of the 8th Air Force and mastermind behind the Tokyo raid, sat quietly at his wooden desk in headquarters, staring intensely at the detailed military incident report. The dilemma was agonizing. By the book, Priest's actions warranted a swift and severe military court-martial. Yet, punishing him meant ignoring an act of supreme, selfless heroism and unparalleled brotherhood in combat. Doolittle knew that awarding Priest the Medal of Honor would essentially endorse this suicidal flying behavior. It might encourage every young hotshot to risk millions of dollars of equipment trying to land in impossible terrain. After 3 days of intense deliberation, General Doolittle successfully threaded the complex, bureaucratic needle. He dismissed any talk of a court-martial, but he also officially downgraded the Medal of Honor recommendation. Instead, Priest would receive the Distinguished Service Cross, the United States military's second highest award. On September 21, 1944, standing on the tarmac at St. Apelmoord Air Base in England, General Doolittle himself pinned the heavy cross onto the chest of the 21-year-old military lieutenant. There were no reprimands spoken that day, only the silent, profound respect of an old warrior acknowledging courage. After the dust of the Second World War finally settled, the two men whose lives were forever fused went separate ways. Bert Marshall finished the war as a decorated ace with 7 confirmed kills and the Silver Star Military Medal. Royce Priest spent 28 years serving in the Air Force, flying cutting-edge jet fighters across the globe. He retired as a full colonel in 1968. The P-51 Mustang that carried them was never enshrined. It was likely scrapped or sold, yet it lives on eternally as a ghost in the annals of global aviation history. In an era defined by cold, mechanical slaughter and unforgiving rules of engagement, human loyalty shone brilliantly. Suspended between life and death, torn between ironclad military rules and an unbreakable bond, Priest chose loyalty. His miraculous insubordination proved to the world what true sacrifice means on the field of human combat. That blood-soaked patch of French farmland bore witness to the absolute zenith of human courage and bravery. Whenever we imagine the deafening scream of that Merlin engine pushing past reality, we are struck anew by their valor. This is an eternal testament to humanity, to loyalty, and to the unbreakable vow that no brother is ever left behind. If you want more deep dives into the most impossible survival missions of history, subscribe now. I will see you next time.